Thanks for staying with us here on The Pulse. Now, President Akufo Addo is demanding the strengthening of existing African Union protocols on good governance to sanction civilians who manipulate their constitutions to extend their stay in power. For him, the condemnation and sanctions imposed on military juntas that overthrow elected governments may not achieve much unless the civilian heads of state are held accountable for their inaction that provide grounds for their overthrow. He was addressing the African Union Security Council dialogue on constitutional changes in the continent.
The reappearance of coups in Africa, in all its forms and manifestations, must be condemned by all, since it seriously undermines our collective bid to rid the continent of the menace of instability and unconstitutional changes in government, as currently defined by the frameworks enshrined in the Lomé Declaration, the Africa Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and other important regional and continental instruments. Unconstitutional regime changes retard a country's growth. As much as the drivers are largely domestic, the international dimension cannot be overlooked. Foreign involvement in fomenting unconstitutional changes, often in favor of repressive governments, foreign economic interests, and other would-be geopolitical benefits, are contributory factors. Some foreign entities regard coups in Africa as a means of enhancing their regional ambitions. As such, they engage in all sorts of disinformation campaigns in a bid to disparage the authority of democratically elected governments and instigate opposition protests against incumbents. In implementing existing continental and regional instruments and protocols, defaulting member states are condemned and suspended from the activities of continental and regional bodies, and individual coup makers are sanctioned. However, the reality is these sanctions have not been applied uniformly. While we're quick to sanction military coup leaders, civilians who achieve similar ends via the manipulation of constitutions to remain in power, for example, go without sanctions, although their actions are clearly prohibited in our legal instruments. This means that the existing frameworks need to be strengthened to capture such infractions.
Well, joining us on phone now is Mutara Momoni Mutar, the Executive Director for the West Africa Center for Counter-Extremism. Grateful that you've been able to join us. So the dialogue is on ways by which we can consolidate democracy across Africa. But is this approach and concern of the President genuine and feasible in the first place?
Hello.
Yes, Mutar, if you
Hello,
can
hear me?
Yes, I'm asking if the approach, the prescription by the President is feasible.
Well, first of all, I listen to the President and he speaks, in some ways directly to the issues relating to the manipulations of constitutions to remain in power by African heads of states without any sanctions or any deterrent actions by any regional bloc like Takeover or the African Union or any of such bodies. And so he understands clearly this indirectly is another form of coup that is currently and continuously taking place within the West African sub-region. Apart from the fact that, we have performed very, very badly even under democratic rules. And so we have to look at, the issue of governance and democracy generally and to review whether the promise of democracy is being realized. We have to look at what democracy is and what the promise of democracy is for all of us. And that would lead us to adopt a more practical, more realistic approach to governance.
If that's the call, obviously the president believes that we shouldn't just be focusing on the military takeovers, focus as well on the civilian government and how some of them perpetuate themselves in power, even at the displeasure of their citizens. How about that too?
Of course, in the last, few months, the conversation, around the region has been largely between democracy and military rule, whether these are, alternatives. Clearly, there should be no place for military rule in Africa and, for that matter, West Africa. Coups are not in any way alternatives to democratic rules. The alternative to bad civilian rule is not a military rule. It is better civilian rule. And we need to be emphasizing on that very, very well to ensure that we look at the indices and the factors that make up what the promise of a democracy for all of us. We're seeing, if you look at, democracy across the West African sub-region, we've seen in many ways we are actually running elections, not running democratic governments. And we need to pay attention to that. We have to move away from just running elections to running democracies that are anchored on good governance and the rule of law. When the president spoke, it points to the fact that, he seemed to be talking about there has to be some measure, some sort of indices that we can hold ourselves, accountable to. We need to have that kind of indices. Indices that point to the fact that if the democracy is doing so bad, we need to point, that out to leaders and make sure that we bring them on the path of democratic rule. We need to ensure that, the reason for which we institute democratic rules are met. If you look at Mali, Burkina Faso, and the two Guineas within West Africa, all of these countries, they rank very, very low in the Human Development Index for 2019. And these are not good indications of solid foundations of a democracy. So all of that has to be put into context and ensure that we are delivering as, democratic nations.
And the regional body itself, the African Union. The African Union is dialoguing on the matter, whilst some sub-regional bodies such as ECOWAS are even failing, and I'm using that word advisedly, failing to act and crack the whip on the...
a bit louder?
Yes, I'm talking about the seeming inaction by the regional bodies to crack down on the military junta. Be it as it may, they are gaining grounds in particularly West Africa, and we've not seen any concrete action to deal with them.
Of course, you would see that, the military governments we have within the region have been largely defiant of any regional caution or any order from West African regional blocs, including ECOWAS. ECOWAS has issued sanctions, has issued, statements relating to suspension of membership. The African Union, including the United Nations and all of those organizations, have issued their own versions of sanctions. But the military leaders have remained defiant, and they continue to do so. The election timelines that were directed to by ECOWAS has been ignored by the countries involved. And so it tells you that there is a very high level of lack of, confidence in these regional blocs. And so they do not command the legitimacy and the support of, the countries within the region. And so it's going to be very, very difficult to have them to cooperate. How do we ensure that these regional blocs, including the African Union, are effective at prevailing on leaders like, military leaders to toe the path of democratic rule? We need to institute that sense of legitimacy in the running of those institutions as well, because they do not command the legitimacy and the trust of the region. So they need to do that. How do we ensure they do that? You have to institute measures that are realistic in terms of implementation and in terms of the reasons for which they are implemented. And that is being largely ignored. The kinds of sanctions that have been implemented, say in the case of Mali, in the case of Guinea, have been, very detrimental to the citizens rather than the leaders. And so these things do not affect the leaders as much as they should have. And so all these things are important when you are instituting measures. But they're just issuing, blanket measures because these are international, tools that are often resorted to in relation to military rules.
Mutara Momoni Mukhtar, I'm grateful for your time. Let's take it.